Please do keep in mind exactly that we will record the presentation and upload the video to our YouTube channel. So if your name or your video and picture shouldn't show up, this is like the time to do it, to change that. Um, I'm happy to present our guest, Dr. Nicholas Beuret, who will present on his recent book, Or Something Worse: Why We Need to Disrupt the Climate Transition, out now on Verso. We will put, or my colleague Vinny will put the link in the chat in case you want to order a copy after the presentation. Before presenting Nicholas and his work, I want to shortly present ourselves. We are the Trade Unions and Labor Environmentalism Network. We are a network of early career researchers that explore broadly how trade unions can advance working class environmentalism. We come from different parts of the world, so that's why I was saying good evening, and different disciplines. We meet monthly and are open to welcome new members. My colleague will share our intake link in the chat as well, and the sign up form for our newsletter, since we organize these sorts of events, I can say every month and a half, approximately. For example, in April, we will have a shared event with the UK-based Transition Security Project, which looks at how militarization is constraining at green transition. So please sign up and follow us also on social media if you want to receive information about our events and our meetings. Vinny is also going to share the links to our social media and everything else in the chat. So back to our guest. Welcome, Nicholas, again. Nicholas is a lecturer at the University of Essex Business School and an activist. His research focuses on green industrial development, climate displacement and migration, and labor. Today, as I mentioned, he will present his latest book, Or Something Worse: Why We Need to Disrupt the Climate Transition. As I mentioned again, if you just joined in, it's out on Verso, and Vinny has shared the link if you want to buy it later. He argues that a version of the green transition is happening, but not the way many of us activists or progressive scholars have envisioned. So I'm happy to have him as a guest today at TULE, and look forward to the Q&A section later on, where you will have a chance to post questions or comments. This event will take between an hour and a half. And remember, we are recording, so if you don't want to see your face on YouTube later on, you should change that now. So go ahead, Nicholas.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me. It's kind of takes me back to the COVID days of doing online events. I haven't done one for a while, which is fantastic. And I do apologize for the lack of slides. Um, those of you based in the UK will understand the absolute carnage that is taking place in the higher education sector, and that includes my university, unfortunately. And as appropriately a UCU rep, that's taking up a lot of my time, unfortunately. But hopefully, my Australian accent is not too much of an impediment to my presentation. What I wanted to do, because I know I've sort of been told like 30, 40 minutes, and that's a challenge. It shouldn't be, but it is. Um, I'm going to try and I want to set out sort of my stall briefly in terms of what the project is and why I've undertaken it, and then kind of go through sort of three things around that are kind of central to the book's argument. The first is what the transition economy is a solution to, the reality of the transition economy, and then the problem of power. That's not how the book is set out. It's kind of how the book is set out, but I want to kind of address those three in particular. But first, I wanted to sort of start by talking about the idea for the book. So for a number of years before I came to academia, because I'm a late entrant, I worked in the NGO sector, particularly in environmental NGOs. And one of the things that happened more often than not, and I remember this really starkly when I was campaigning on the Climate Change Act in the UK, was that there'd be a stark divide between what we'd call the professional optimism of climate campaigners, but also journalists and business consultants around anything to do with climate, anything to do with like climate policy, rates of EV adoption, electrification, all that sort of stuff. And then the private sort of conversations that would almost reflect the complete opposite, which was like nothing happening is happening, everything's a false solution, all these policies are a lie. So you'd get a real um, divide inside NGOs, but I think that's reflective of the broader conversations that have happened for the last decade at the very least around climate policy, particularly in terms of the problem of net zero or a climate transition or a green transition. Um, Now, there's a huge amount to be said there in terms of the deep cynicism that animates professional optimists in the climate sphere, all the way through to how it reflects on the kinds of approaches we take to climate campaigning. And maybe we can get into those later on. But the main thing that I wanted to get to was that, at least for the past decade, after I sort of left the NGO sector and started in academia, one of the problems that's concerned me is sort of being a disquiet at this sort of idea that either there's a viable solution to climate change that's enacted at a state level, or any solution, or there's not, or more specifically, that anything that is a solution to climate change is necessarily good, and that anything that has a negative impact or is bad is actually a false solution, is a lie, is a farce. It's an indication that transition is not really happening. One of the problems that I've sort of stuck with me from the NGO sector was this idea that if there was a transition, it would necessarily be a good thing. And that we could actually judge transitions and transition economics around whether or not they, on the first hand, at the most simple, like basic level, whether or not they address climate change adequately, but also whether or not they're good or not. So that's the sort of problem that I started with. And it came from an intuition that there really was a transition underway, but it was actually really shit. And it was destructive, it was damaging, it actually might be something worse in many respects. Now, what I want to do is sort of contextualize that a little bit by talking about what I'm talking about as the transition economy, and then sort of go through what it's supposed to be a solution to, the reality of the transition, what it's actually creating, and then the problem of power. Now, the transition itself, if you wanted to take a sort of a step back, and here I'm treating the transition as basically three things at the same time. The first is as a fraction of capital. The idea that there are net zero businesses, there are renewable energy businesses, there are EV businesses. There's a fraction of capital we could consider to be some sort of transition economy or transition capital. It's also a set of regulations. And it's like I'm not heavily into the regulation school, but in the sense that every economic arrangement has a series of regulations around it. So state regulations that constrain, shape, and foster it or inhibit it to one degree or another. So I'm also talking about the transition as a regulation, a kind of regulation. It's also a period of time. Within that tripart schema, there is a sort of a genesis point. And that genesis point occurs after the 2008 financial crisis. Prior to that, for about 10 or 15, I think at least for a decade, if not a little bit longer, there had been discussions in sort of heterodox economic circles amongst sort of post-Keynesian think tanks like the New Economic Foundation, or even NGOs like Friends of the Earth. There had been discussion of how you'd use post-Keynesian economics or ecological economics to sort of solve climate change. There was early articulations of what has come to be known as the Green New Deal as a particular mode of thinking. And if you go back and look at sort of the New Economic Foundation, which is a heterodox UK economic think tank, you can see that for decades now they've been articulating things that would populate a Green New Deal if one was ever enacted. All of these sort of ideas and processes were in ferment, and there's a tendency to think there's a continuity between those early ideas, those left-wing progressive economic ideas, and what was begun to be articulated after about 2008 in response to the financial crisis as climate policies, net zero policies, Europe's Green Deal, Obama's early policies through to Biden's IRA. But there's actually quite a strong break. And the reason there's a strong break is that all those early policies were focused very much on creating a steady state economy, on addressing social justice, on tackling climate change, and were in many ways quite hard breaks with not just neoliberalism, but many of the basic long-standing capitalist precepts. They were really like calls for hard forms of social democracy. What we got after the 2008 crisis was the mobilization of some of the rhetoric and a few of the ideas in these sort of doctrines to achieve a very specific policy outcome. And that policy outcome was to address the problem of economic stagnation. And if you want to understand the transition economy, that's the core problem it sets out to solve. The core problem it sets out to be solved is not climate change. In the sense, climate change is the means to restart economic growth in the global north at the very least. Now, in the book, I get into a lot more of the theories around stagnation, how like the structural constraints and the rest of it. From a majoritarian economic perspective, there are really kind of two interlocked drivers for this stagnation that set in, obviously, but existed prior to, but set in obviously after 2008. One is a collapse of effective demand at a global level, at least amongst the economies of the global north. And the second is a persistent excess of capacity, overwhelmingly like a manufacturing capacity, but we can also think about this in terms of excess capital that's been left idle, used purely for speculation or destructive, sort of economically destructive activities. I tend to focus far more on Marxist notions of overaccumulation in the book, but we can park them for now in terms of what's the emphasis of transition economics and transition policies is to address both of those at the same time. So starting after 2008 and really accelerating after 2015 with the Paris Accord, what we see is the creation of a series of frameworks, tools, mechanisms that we could consider as a mode of transition regulation. Now, what this constituted in fits and starts was a series of government mechanisms to encourage private investment in transition industries. And by transition industries, I mean a combination of manufacturing, infrastructure, but also, probably most pointedly, investment in research and development that would then drive, that sort of that magic word for neoliberal economics or post-neoliberal economics, innovation. Government wanted to do this, and this is increasingly the consensus, was probably the new consensus, we could say instead, around most economic development. Government focused on doing this by typical mechanisms of de-risking investment and encouraging investment through everything from tax breaks through to state-backed insurance regimes and financial sort of incentives by mandating new markets, so transitions to EVs or mandating heat pumps or solar panels for housing, for instance, or insulation, all create new markets. They do the same thing through circular economic, incentives and mandates as well. And also guaranteeing profits. And they can do this either through ensuring government contracts or just by paying the difference in terms of the contracts for difference that you see with wind farms and other renewable projects. Governments set out to encourage this idle capital to be put to use, either creating new industries, retrofitting old industries, or investing in research and development in order to solve climate change as a problem. So climate change was the motor to get things going. But the objective was to restore economic growth by doing these three things. It's, in a sense, the transition economy from its regulatory point of view is a means of privatizing the problem of climate adaptation and climate mitigation. Now, there are reasons to focus, or governments focused primarily on infrastructure and manufacturing. Overwhelmingly for infrastructure, it's because it's sunk capital, you can create new forms of green rentierism, it guarantees profits, a secure investment. For manufacturing, one of the reasons to focus on green manufacturing is that manufacturing typically has powerful multiplier effects, creates, significant value chains, large significant numbers of direct and indirect employment outside the primary site of production. It's also where productivity growth happens. And one of the core problems with economic growth around 2008 and since has been a collapse in productivity growth. So it was seen as sort of the way into solving the problem of economic growth. was also supposed to be a win in that it would generate jobs, revenue for governments that are like, have budgetary shortfalls, and in a nice ideal world, it would stop climate change. Now, suffice to say, that's not how things turned out. It's still the framework, but we're already starting to see some of the cracks appear, and so that you can understand some of the mechanism, some of the processes or events unfolding in the US is in some ways a recognition that if this was the pathway to economic growth or within a particular transition framework, that the US is unlikely to succeed within a global marketplace around this and is somewhat retreating back from trying to implement the transition framework in order to achieve economic growth. In a sense, it's lost the race to net zero, so it's trying to double down on existing fossil industries and AI. If that's the objective with the caveat, and it doesn't seem to be working, then in the initial assessment, we could sort of say that the assessment that it's a lie, that's fake, that it's not real is accurate, that there is no real transition and it's really not stopping climate change. Part of the problem with looking at the framework, seeing what it set out to do, and making that sort of assessment is that it then misses the very real economic growth, job growth, and surge in financial investment that's poured into these industries and sectors. Investment in just in renewable energy is like at least in the last year is double that of fossil fuels. The net zero sector in the UK, which is shorthand for the transition industries, is growing at 10% per year, which is 10 times the rate of the rest of the economy. There are millions of jobs in this sector or sectors at a global level. It's a very real fraction of capital, and it's a very real set of regulations, regulatory frameworks, incentives, and injunctions at a governmental level. So at least from an economic point of view, it's real, and from a government regulatory point of view, it's real. It just so happens that it's not going to stop climate change below 3 degrees, and it just so happens that it's not, at this point, reviving economic growth at a broad level. One of the ways we can sort of understand that is by looking at a specific example. I think a really good example is the steel industry in the UK because it's become quite a flashpoint. Now, when I was writing the book, and end of 2004, beginning 2005, just as putting the final touches on it, the steel mill, one of the UK's last remaining steel mills in Port Talbot in Wales, was threatened with closure. Now, what had happened is that the owners, Tata Steel, had said that the mill was losing a million pounds a day. It just couldn't compete anymore. Now, the UK used to consume most of the steel produced in the UK, but that's since shifted. Like, between 1980 and 2000, we'd gone from being a majority consumer of the steel we produce to a majority exporter. In fact, we export all but 12% of the steel produced in the UK. So in that sense, it sort of captures the initial manufacturing conditions. And, we're dealing with international competition as the primary arena around which decisions are made around production and manufacturing or closure and deindustrialization. Tata Steel said they were losing a million pounds a day. They went to the government and said, unless you give us some money, we're going to close it. And the government said, we'll give you a third of the cost of transforming your coal-fired blast furnaces to green electricity-powered arc furnaces. We'll give you a third of the cost. That's $500 million if you keep the jobs. Tata Steel said, you know what, we'll invest in the green industries. We'll get behind what we're going to assume is going to be a future of carbon border tariffs, and we'll keep some jobs. And the government said, fantastic. Here's $500 million. And Tata Steel said, fantastic. We're going to transition to green furnaces and we're going to sack half our workforce of 4,000 people, devastating Port Talbot. This was sold as a win. And one of the reasons I think it's an important example is that it captures what constitutes, I guess we could call the betrayed promises of the green transition. The move to green manufacturing when we retrofit an industry or the substitution of one kind of green manufacturing for another, electric vehicles for ICEs or fossil fuel vehicles, tends to result in the loss of jobs, both because green industries tend to be less labor intensive at a basic level, like EVs have fewer parts than ICE cars, for example, but also because every time you come back to a factory, every time you come back to a manufacturing plant or a production line, and you want to substantially transform it, that process tends to come along with increased automation. Just greening industry already loses you jobs in most instances. One of the reasons, though, it's worse than that is that greening steel doesn't necessarily gain you market share at a global level. If most industry is export orientated and has to compete, greening industry just switches the area of overcapacity and overconsumption, or overcapacity and underconsumption. The world is already awash in green steel capacity, all kinds of steel capacity. And the same is in most industries. And the picture's not that much better in China. China's already undergoing its own somewhat premature wave of green deindustrialization as jobs are lost, creating their own sort of rust belts across China, and as green industries themselves consolidate. One of the reasons it's a good example is that it sort of captures one of the principal dynamics of the transition economy is that rather than resolving the problems of overcapacity and underconsumption, all it does is green them, in some instances making it even worse, particularly when we get to the fact that of increased in automation and lower labor intensity in green manufacturing. One of the side effects has been, at least in Port Talbot, is a surge in support for reform, or I would call reform very much like Trump and MAGA, the first transition political parties that have actually and accurately captured some of the sentiment of the betrayal of the green transition that's underway and started to mobilize that politically. So there's quite a lot of, there's been a decline in union membership and a surge in support for reform and other far right parties in Port Talbot in reaction to this process. If manufacturing plants or heavy industry plants like Port Talbot aren't where jobs have been put on in the net zero sector, as I was saying before in the UK, or we can ask where they are. At least outside of Chinese global value chains, what the green industries look like, what the transition economy looks like, is an intensification of the trend and drive towards service industries in the global north, particularly service industries that are located within small and medium-sized enterprises. In the UK, in the US, China, Germany, the net zero sector, the transition economy is dominated by installation work. That is installing things made somewhere else. And they could be everything from solar panels and heat pumps through to like software components. Increasingly, manufacturing is also a work of assembly rather than actual construction itself. Quite a lot of the manufacturing, at least in Europe, is increasingly looking like assembling things made in China, but just in a German factory, a Hungarian factory, to make it as though it were manufactured in the EU. Assembly work, this sort of work of installation, is typically done through small and medium-sized enterprises. It tends to be waged lower wage than secure industry work. It has a lower multiplier effect. Fewer additional jobs are created through it. The supply chains tend to be located in other countries. Value tends to be captured elsewhere, not in the country of installation itself. Increasingly, we're also already seeing installation work be subject to downward wage pressures as more and more people enter the sector, and automation. There was the first recorded large solar array built by robots just a few months ago. So we're already seeing some of the other dynamics come into play, and we can assume that AI will only make this worse. The other main sector, of course, is recycling and waste processing. Again, a sector, 2/3 of which is incredibly precarious and low waged. At least a quarter of the workforce doing that sort of work in Europe is migrant, with a significant component being undocumented as well. So what we're seeing is employment is surging, at least in the green industries in the global north, and in two areas that don't have strong multiplier effects, don't contribute strongly to growth, that are largely resistant to productivity gains, that are precarious, often low waged. Many of the small businesses have much higher failure rates than other comparable small businesses. So we're not seeing good industry jobs replaced or restored with other industry jobs. What we're finding is that the green economy is building out an intensification of that precarious, low-waged, insecure work centered around small and medium-sized enterprises that was really first developed through neoliberalism. It's worth coming back just for a second to climate change before I get into the last section, just to note that all of this is happening within a trajectory towards 3 degrees, and we're already seeing, to mention it more than once, the accelerating climate impacts. It's worth noting it, not just because of the catastrophic effects, but because rather than just focus on the sort of like the spectacular floods across Pakistan or droughts or plagues of locusts or or catastrophic fires in Australia or all the rest of it, we should think about this accelerating climate, sort of climate catastrophe as having sort of two intersecting impacts on both our quality of life and the economy itself. Now, climate change for most of us doesn't arrive as a disaster. It arrives as an increase in costs. Food inflation, the cost of services, as inflation then impacts things like government services, as a decrease in the social wage. It makes things more expensive for us, reducing our discretionary spending, making our lives meaner. I saw a line the other day sort of saying life increasingly seems like one without even the little luxuries. Things cease to be affordable. Things that we used to think we could have, we no longer can. That has a secondary effect for both us, but also if we think about it just in terms of for governments, as we have to spend more on the basics, there's less left over for further spending. And the same goes for local government. The more you have to spend on basic infrastructure maintenance, the less you have to spend on the social wage, from libraries through to adult care. That then has another effect on the rest of the economy, obviously slowing down economic growth, reducing aggregate demand. The second impact is in the little disruptions. Obviously, flooding, fires, huge economic impacts, destroy businesses' lives, all the rest of it. But climate change doesn't just do that. It increases small disruptions at a daily level. Things go out of service, potholes increase on roads, trains, get cancelled, shops have to close for repairs, internet like services go down, telephone lines go down. These small disruptions also add to the friction of like the global of local economies and to the costs to us in our daily lives. The two taken together both further slow or disrupt economic growth, further tank job creation, business creation, economic activity that would then increase government revenues. But they also politically curtail any sort of investment in the future. If you spend more and more time just struggling to get by, just navigating disruption, the future seems smaller. The space for political action shrinks. Horizons are foreshortened. The combination of the two means the transition economy, at least in a broader political register, perversely seems as though, while it was designed in some senses to save the future, restore growth, and stop climate change, it seems like a radical shrinkage of both back to almost a horizon of nothing much more than survival. Now, I'm going to try and wrap it up in another 8 minutes, and so we'll see how we're doing. All this presents a picture, at least at sort of very broad brushstrokes, one that requires intervention, particularly if we're dealing with a fraction of capital, a period of time, and a kind of regulation. It also means it's a terrain of politics. There are pressure points, spaces of intervention, areas for organizing, essentially. Now, if somewhat cheekily, but also quite seriously, we treat reform and MAGA set as transition actors, as fighting a war of transition, as intervening into these three in order to transform them, shape them towards political ends. We can also ask, are they countervailing forces? What are the progressive or left-wing forces that are contesting the transition? And if we're being really honest at the moment, beyond defensive struggles, there aren't any. In fact, there are very few that take the transition seriously as something that is either yet to happen or is not just a lie. Like environment groups tend to treat it overwhelmingly outside of the sphere of professional optimists as something that's not happening at all yet. That we still need to force governments to act. That it's not actually happened. Unions tend to treat it as a farce that, and more often than not, fight defensive struggles to keep the existing industries open. So, for example, one of the principal unions for the Port Talbot steel mill was Unite, and its solution was just to keep all the blast furnaces open and then demand more government investment in heavy industry in in sectors that were already massively over capacity at a global level. It's worth bearing in mind that Port Talbot was 1.5% of the UK's emissions, carbon emissions, so which is a huge, I think it's the single largest site of emissions in the UK. In other words, it was a defensive struggle to keep emitting carbon. Beyond that, we have struggles around blocking wind farms and solar arrays. We have some disquiet around policy injunctions. We have some nice slogans and a few political parties putting forward ideas and positions, but in countries like the UK, but there's not really a movement around the transition. There's not really a concerted coalition of actors. And I think it's important, at least I said that in the book, it's important to recognize that we're starting from the point where we can't just can't take a neoclassical approach and assume a movement and then set out some prescriptions for what that movement should do, or we should assume we can take power at government and set out the correct policies. We have to start from the question of how would we actually construct a movement in the very first place. And I'll end this by like name checking the three sites where I think that can be first done. The first is to recognize that the cost of living crisis is climate politics. The cost of food, the cost of energy, transportation, the basic access to services run through the social wage. These are all climate policies. These are all spaces of climate action. And that historically there's been an endless succession of movements, organizations, actors that have contested the cost of living, from rent to bread in the market, oil. In fact, I was looking at a list today that almost every single major revolt since the so-called Arab Spring 2010, 2011 has been a cost of living revolt. Almost every single major social crisis conflict has been built around this. So there's incredible array, an incredible potential there for organizing, but organizing in a way that connects climate change to the cost of living and doesn't fall into the trap of reform, which is pitting the cost of living against climate action. The second is that if this is the transition that they're articulating, that we have to move past the defensive struggles, existing defensive struggles that most unions conduct, and start to articulate an alternate vision. Now, so that we can't really do that at a sort of an abstract level. So what would it mean to articulate a counter proposal or a counter vision in a way that's concrete and realizable? And I think it's worth returning to some of the lessons learned through the move towards whole worker organizing, the return of community organizing after 2008, but also that sort of brief period where there was an investment in local municipal politics, and see what we could draw from those three in order to enact some sort of counter planning or organizing at a municipal level, around a local town, municipality, or region, and treat a community as though it were a workplace, not just take the transition town sort of approach of thinking about, well, how can we change our local area as consumers, but what would it mean to transition a town like where I am, Colchester or Stroud, Sunderland, as though it were a workplace foregrounding production. I think the third one is, in some senses, we need to come back and recognize that the environment movement has lost its way a little bit in large parts of the global north, and it tends to focus on, for lack of a better word, symbolic action. Even when those actions are disruptive, like slow walking through traffic or throwing paint on the Mona Lisa is a symbolic action. But that's a far cry from the sort of the peak moments of environmental action. I'm thinking blockading fracking sites occupying logging queues or mine sites. At least in the UK, some of the high points were the anti-roads and anti-GMO campaigns in the 90s that actively stopped two government programs. I think there's a necessity for at least as environmentalists to have a bit of a moment of reflection to think about how can we return to disruptive forms of activism and how could we do those in a way that not just sustained the actors that we have and not burn them out as we've seen in the UK with Just Stop Oil and XR, where we've created a sort of a milieu of burnt out activists or jailed activists, but actually sustain disruptive power over the longer term. What I'll do is I'll leave it there. Hopefully, I've run too roughshod over everything, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you
And
so much, Nicholas. Yes.
no, no,
Go
I
ahead.
was trying to figure out how to wind it up.
Okay, okay. So, let me just make this a bit bigger. So, yeah, thank you again, Nicholas, very much for your clear presentation on your book. We will move now to the